As always, it's great to have you with us again. Our guest today is Dr. Cliff Robertson Jr., Executive Director of the Warriors Refuge, a nonprofit organization in West Columbia, Texas, that provides shelter, counseling, resources, and training to veterans in need. Cliff Robertson, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Man, Chris, it's great to be here. It's such an honor. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
No, appreciate your time. So, Cliff, share with us more of your background and the story of the Warriors Refuge.
Well, the story of the Warriors Refuge and my background are, well, I just call it all kind of a miracle, to be honest. I'm a Navy vet. I spent 6 years. Part of it was on an aircraft carrier, the USS America and the USS George Washington. I was an air traffic controller. Did the 50th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. I was there did 2 trips to the Persian Gulf, and got to see a good part of the world, but also saw some challenges too. We had a young man in the Mediterranean decide to jump off the ship in the middle of the night, and you don't jump off of an aircraft carrier and survive, not usually. And what I came to find out is there were things going on inside him that weren't being addressed, and which brought me to veteran suicide, which brought me to some real issues. And I had some personal challenges in my life where I ended up really having lost personally everything, and I ended up in need beyond what I could take care of myself. So I ended up actually in a veterans shelter myself. If you were to go to our website, thewarriorsrefuge.us, you'll read a little bit of my story. But it ended up being a launching pad for me. And so I'd always wanted to kind of pay that back, pay that forward. I always wanted to be in a place where I could give back, but I didn't really know where to begin. So my beautiful wife was encouraging me, Christmas, 2 or 3 years ago now, you really want to go and support your dad at this disabled American veterans Christmas party. I'll be honest, I really haven't been heavily involved in those associations because, I've had so many other things going on. So we went, and I ended up sitting down next to this Vietnam War veteran. He was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. The fact that he survived as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam is a miracle by itself. But we sat down next to him, and I'd never met him before. And he started talking about this building that he owned, that he had wanted to turn into a shelter, but he just didn't have the know-how. He didn't have the energy. He's in his 80s, but he had this desire and he wanted to do something with it. And I began to share a little bit of my story and my desire. So we began talking, and 6 months later, he transferred the building over to the nonprofit that we started, and the Warriors Refuge became a reality. And we were given a nursing home that had a value of close to $1 million, even unrenovated. And we've since renovated almost the entire building. We're working directly hand in hand with the VA. We've got, I think we're up to 50 residents right now, and we're doing a little bit of everything from counseling, both chemical dependency, mental health, to employment training, employment empowerment. We've got some internal training programs. We partner with others to help them get back to work, and we help them with everything. What do you think you need to start over in life? And that's where we begin. They come to us with sometimes nothing, and we help them push that restart button on life.
We both know that homelessness is an issue among a segment of the veteran population. Is there an average profile of the homeless vet?
Not really. I will tell you that I have met men and women that been homeless, that comprise anything where if somebody dealing with PTSD to somebody who got into a really bad situation. Let me tell you a story. I met this gentleman several years back, and you meet him today, you would never know it, but he's got an MBA from prestigious university. And this was before he became homeless, but he lost his wife. And at that moment, he gave up on life. And when he gave up on life, he ended up losing everything in that process. And literally, they had to carry him out of his house as it was being foreclosed upon. And fast forward 8 months later, he's finding his way to a veterans homeless shelter. Actually, he's being brought by a friend. And fast forward 6 months after that, he's back on his feet. He's restarted his business. He's re-engaged with life. He needed a place. Now, is that typical? No. But you get people from that extreme. You get people who are dealing with very real post-traumatic stress disorder that is far more disabling than most people realize. And survivor's remorse and all of the things that go with it. There are people who have seen things, Chris, that we can't even begin to imagine today. I know you've had some guests that probably have shared some stories, but I'm just telling you, there's some things that people have gone through in a counseling session with me that, let's just say, cannot be repeated.
You mentioned the one specific incident for this veteran losing his wife. Is there a period of time when veterans are most vulnerable to becoming homeless, or is it more of a specific situation?
I guess what happens when they don't get treatment for like those. This one guy who lost his wife, yeah, grief. But oftentimes they don't know where to begin again. Let me give you another example. There was this gentleman who was Army vet. He drove armor personnel carriers. He was his commander's driver, and had in Iraq, and they had vehicles around them throughout his 2 tours in Iraq explode. When he got back from his last tour, he couldn't leave his he couldn't leave his house for a month because every loud noise, he thought it was going to be another IED, improvised explosive device, go off. He ended up becoming homeless because when you're not paying your rent, when you're not doing that. So I think a lot of times some of the impetus is a lack of real transitional treatment. There's transitional programs when you're leaving, but a lot of times people will say, well, I'm okay. And they're not. It's not because that's not available. It's that they'll sometimes skip a step. And I think that treatment is an issue, and that lack of treatment sometimes will go into a period of self-treatment, meaning they'll get lost in drugs. PTSD and drugs, according to statistics, go hand in hand about 70% of the time. So
mind-blowing statistic.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
no, you did. There's no one specific point in time. It's just, I don't want to say part of the process, but it's just case by case.
Yeah, and then sometimes let me go back to another story. I'm kind of a storyteller. We can do statistics, but I'd rather tell stories because they're much more interactive. We had a guy that he got out. He seemed to transition fine out of the military, and then something happened at work, and there was a meltdown, and because he hadn't gotten the treatment, and he lost that job. They didn't know what to do with him. And sometimes there's just triggers that even the guy that's going through it, the veteran going through it, man or woman, they don't realize that it's a trigger. And they have to be willing to go through a process of working through that. And that's where counseling, psychiatry, all those things will help. But it could be anything. If you had to put one little tagline on it, I would say a lack of mental well-being.
Very straightforward. You've noted before that there are different definitions and different degrees of homelessness and what you call near homelessness. Could you walk us through those differences and why those distinctions are important?
Well, the there's the near homelessness where somebody is couch surfing, for lack of a better way of terming. That's kind of the slang term uh, for it, and they'll go from place to place, and technically they're not homeless. They're not living under the bridge or in a park or in a tent out in the field, which sometimes they do. But that near homelessness is they still have a few resources, but that person is truly at risk of being homeless at any moment. And the level of stress that induces is incredible. I mean, think about it for a minute, Chris. If you knew at any moment, because it had happened, at any moment you were going to have to be looking for somewhere else to rest your head. You didn't know that the people you're staying with could say, "Hey, listen, man, you're out," which happens every day. So that's the near homeless. There are those that are there's another classification that are what I would call at risk of being homeless. They're not near, but they're at risk, and those are the people who have the untreated diagnosis. Those are the people who have begun to self-medicate, um, and that is actually a larger number than most people realize. The last numbers I saw were that in the veteran population, there's approximately 1 million men and women who are at risk of being homeless. And part of that goes back to another statistic. According to, I can't remember the psychological journal that I got it from, but there were 62% of people who suffer from PTSD do not realize that there is a treatment, there's an answer that can help them. So that plays into that number too. And again, a lot of times they start doing things that are unhealthy, um, that lead them to lead them to becoming homeless.
I've read that while only 8% of Americans can claim veteran status, 17% of our homeless population is made up of veterans. In 2010, the Department of Veteran Affairs estimated on any given night there were 76,000 homeless veterans sleeping on American streets. And that number was believed to be down by 50% in 2019 before the pandemic hit. Another 1.5 million are estimated to be at risk of homelessness. Do you think those estimates are too high, too low, fairly accurate? And whatever the number is, what does that tell you about the approach to the problem?
Well, I believe the number. I've read that same number from 2019, and I'll be honest, I think it's low. The way that they do those numbers is through a point in time count, a pit count, they call it, and we're a part of that at the Refuge, and we collaborate with different providers to come up with those numbers. And what it comes down to is, um, are they going to all the places where um, veterans or the homeless are really congregating? And I will tell you that a lot of times they're not. They're not anymore. Um, and I'll also tell you that sometimes veterans will tell you, "I'm not homeless," and they're staying in the car. They have a place to stay. So if you tell that person who's doing the count that "I'm not homeless," they can't mark you down. So I think that number is low. Um, I do think the at risk of being homeless is probably just about right. Um, we're actually getting ready to expand our counseling program to begin to work with veterans that aren't in the shelter, that are just veterans that are in need, veterans and family members. And what we found is just in beginning those conversations that the need is far greater. A lot of times, the medication that's given um, through well-meaning, um, psychiatric or even primary care physicians, not necessarily even through the VA, can cause somebody to lose the ability to function, and because they're not following up with active or aggressive counseling through all means available. It's real simple to give somebody medication, and a lot of times they realize that, so they take themselves off the medication that would help them, and they spiral down, and then they're at risk.
So, where does mental illness fit into the homelessness equation?
I would say that in veteran homelessness, everybody we come in contact has some level of mental health disorder, whether it's minor depression or anxiety or full blown PTSD. Occasionally, we even run into people who have paranoid schizophrenia. And part of that, what's sad is part of that can end up being drug induced. In other words, they were taking illegal drugs that ended up, messing up their chemical the chemical balances inside that led them there. Most of these things can be treated because a lot of times people refuse the treatment.
So we think of
But yeah, I
veteran
would say 100%.
Perfect. We think of veteran homelessness as only affecting men, but the number of homeless female veterans is perhaps even a more serious concern, isn't it?
It is. It is for two reasons. One, it's the fastest growing segment of homelessness, and it's scary because they can be especially vulnerable because a lot of times the female veteran population also has kids to go with them. So it's not just them, it's their children. And the challenge for most shelter, supportive housing systems is they don't have a way to help with those children. So if you get the woman, she's not going to part with the kids. So how do you manage that in a communal living environment? It is difficult, and in fact, we haven't figured that out yet. We want to in the future, but we haven't. There's just too many variables, so much liability, so much additional care that's needed. But yeah, I mean, I would say that because they can be particularly vulnerable, they can also have kids that make them again especially vulnerable, and it makes it doubly difficult because now they got to figure out childcare, they got to figure out how to get back to work, they've got to have these appointments to begin to get themselves, okay up here, and what do they do with their kids in the meantime? It's kind of this spiral that tough to solve.
I tend to think, and I believe most Americans do as well, that anyone who's gone through military training as organized and self-sufficient. What factors are driving homelessness in this sector of Americans?
Because they don't want to ask for help. They get into a tough spot, and they want to figure it out. They want to work the problem. That's one of the things we learned in the military. You've got a problem. Let's figure it out. Let's work the problem. And they get to a point to where they can't. And then the mental health issues take place and they give up. And then sometimes there are people who don't understand what's going on, or the mental health situation is worse than the person individually understands. So they quit. I mean, honestly, the veteran suicide rate at 22 a day, I think is probably a little low.
That's
And
astonishing.
it's tragic.
It's beyond tragic. And for someone like you who's a professional in the field, you're hearing stats where that number is actually dropping, but you're seeing it real time, day in, day out, and you think that number is low.
Yeah, I see it. I mean, in my little microcosm, okay, I'm seeing. I mean, we're dealing with veteran suicide 2 or 3 times a week. They haven't been successful. We've been able to intervene, but if in my little microcosm, if we're seeing it 2 to 3 times a week, it's hard to believe that the number is
The
falling.
numbers are there. Yep, agree. The Warriors Refuge helps get a veteran back on his or her feet by getting them off the streets and into your homeless shelter, counseling and resource training center. But the work doesn't just stop there. I hope our listeners understand what happens next and how do you find long-term permanent housing for them.
Well, we do a couple of things. The first thing, one of the things you mentioned there is we have what we call our Warrior Empowerment Project, where we are getting them some pieces of education. Maybe we're getting them plugged into an education program, or some of the things we're doing ourselves. Like we've got a heavy equipment operator training that we do. We do some computer training, things like that. So getting them to what I call a living wage is important. Because you can't survive on minimum wage and provide for a household. So there's that. Finding them long-term permanent housing can be difficult too, especially if they are disabled. What we try to do is we try to plug into, if they're disabled and they've got a limited income that's never going to improve beyond their disability rating, we can plug them into what's called HUD Bash, which is a HUD-based program that's specifically for veterans, that is veterans assistive housing, supportive housing. And it's basically a Section 8 program for veterans only. And we've had a lot of success placing them there. One of the things that we're working on for the future is we've actually recently identified a piece of land we hope to be able to buy and renovate, as well as add some long-term disabled housing, so it'd be more of a permanent supportive housing environment. We're hoping to be able to start that project before the end of the year, but it's a real challenge. I'll be honest with you, finding that, placing that person, getting into a living wage is actually easier, and finding that person a place to live than it is somebody who simply cannot. It's tough.
So that being said, what do you think the solution is to the bigger problem of veteran homelessness across the country, or is there one?
I think I think the biggest problem comes back to, if we really want to fix the problem, it's really at, I would say, 2 to 3 levels. The first part is, I believe that everybody transitioning from the military really needs to go through some pretty tough psychological assessments to see where they really are. I can tell you I'm okay because I don't want to talk to you about it. So I mean, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it anymore. And I can bypass, all the stuff. But if you put them through very real assessments, I would say more than 2 that are really psychologically strong, that really can find those weak points and get them plugged into some sort of counseling psychiatric program, I think that would really help. Because, I mean, let's face it, in the military, you're going to see things a lot of times that you're not going to see anywhere else, and it's usually not good things. So I would recommend that as part of that transition out. The second part of it is, I think we have to aggressively, I would say, not just advertise, but promote the fact that there are real solutions to PTSD. There are real ways to work through this. I think that's the second part of the problem, because, again, with over half of the men and women who suffer not knowing that there is something that they can really do. I mean, again, these were their words. There's no solution to this, and really encouraging, promoting, pushing, not just a sign like in the VA hospital that says, if you're suffering from PTSD, come see us, but really talking about a real dialogue about it. And the third thing is, a lot of times shelters like ours don't provide the counseling and also, as well as the employment. Sometimes they are simply just a holding place. They've got 90 to 180 days. Good luck, God bless, hope it works for you. And what happens is, they go from one program, they get out of that program for a week or two, then they go to the next one. So I think holding the line and having better programs, stronger programs, I think those are probably the top 3 answers if I had to come up with a good solution for it.
And we're going to talk about solutions to post-traumatic stress in the second half of the show, and specifically what you're doing at the Warriors Refuge. A few minutes going to the break here, how much of an impact does chemical dependency have on the segment of the population that you serve, and how are you able to address it?
We deal with chemical dependency every day, every night. It is an ongoing battle, because with people who are suffering, with people who, whether it's PTSD or something else, chemical dependency is their way to self-medicate. They're trying to work the problem, and that's the way that they've found to fix it, to help level things out. we have what we call an intensive outpatient program where they've got group sessions 3 days a week. Everybody meets with a licensed chemical dependency counselor. It's just a really hyperactive program where we have to be involved and really, really intense about it. I mean, that's just the best way. And if we find that people aren't responding to that, they're still struggling with that dependency, we're very quick to pull the trigger and say, okay, you need to go really dry out at a rehabilitation center. And when you get through there, come back. We've got a spot for you, and we'll start this again. And we've had to do that. We've had to do that.
And I think I know the answer to this question, but has the pandemic affected the mental health of people that Warriors Refuge serves?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's tough. The isolation. It's been tough getting work. Our volunteers that everybody is known to come to love and the way they help. It's been tough. It's been tough. Absolutely, it's impacted us in more ways than I probably fully understand.
So, Doc, we've gotten together because the Warriors Refuge will be receiving and putting to use a virtual reality system called BraveMind from the nonprofit that I co-founded called Soldier Strong. BraveMind virtual reality recreates traumatic situations such as battlefield encounters. They're at the root of a veteran's post-traumatic stress. What drew you and the Warriors Refuge to the BraveMind system, and how much do you expect to use it?
Well, Chris, first of all, I want to say I'm so honored to be even a part of that process and program. And what drew me to it is I'm always looking for um, what is the what are the best practices in post traumatic stress disorder counseling? What are the things that what's the cutting edge? What's the next best thing? Because if what we're doing currently isn't as effective as we really want it to be, what can we do next? What else can we do? And one of the things that I found before I found before I found Brave Minds was I was actually having the veteran write down his experience. Tell me your story, write it down, and then let's begin to talk about it. And and it's all about helping them understand their own narrative and work through it. And that's actually that's actually a counseling theory called it's a narrative counseling theory. And but the challenge with that is actually getting them to really write it down. You would think that it wouldn't be that difficult, but it is. It is like trying to get Congress to do something. Not trying to get political,
Herculean.
just trying to get Congress to move is, we all heard the term, it takes an act of Congress. Okay. It's like that. And I would say out of 10 people that, you approach and have them try to do that, you might get one. So with that and trying to get creative and all that, it forced me to dive deeper. So when I began to do research, I found my new hero, I think probably yours too, Dr. Skip Rizzo's research. And I began to read it. I began to understand it. While I'm not part of the video game generation per se, I didn't miss it by much. I grew up with Pong and all that, but I still love, love some of that stuff. I was around with my kids and all that. So his writing, his research, his depth of understanding, and the assessment tools as well, all of it just made sense. So while I can't get them to necessarily write it down, you put them in that environment, I can get them to begin to talk about it. I can get them in that that virtual reality place, and I can get them to begin to talk about it in that safe environment, and that's exciting to me. So honestly, this is actually what drove our application to be able to um, begin to gear up to be ready to offer these counseling services to the veteran population beyond the shelter. And in fact, once we get it fully set up in West Columbia, we're going to have at least one other location We might be coming back to you guys for for a third unit, hopefully, maybe by the end of the year. But we're going to get the first one, and then we're going to get a second one in a second location, probably up in Brenham, Texas, is where we're looking for the second one. But we want to get the first one up and going first. But anyway, I mean, honestly, I think it'll be something that's used every day. And in fact, one of the things that I'll probably do is have 1 to 2 counselors that do nothing but that, and they split time in the we call it the boom room. Split time in the boom room, because you spend time with them going through the scenario, and then you spend time with them outside of it talking about it. So I foresee it being a real awesome process.
I never served in the military, but I did try Dr. Rizzo's technology a few years ago, and it is powerful. There are 14 different worlds, he calls them, and anything from being in a Humvee on the road to a forward operating base, hospital, to walking through an Afghani village. And it is just very, very powerful, and can truly see the benefit to that. So I wish you and your veterans down there a lot of success with that. Disability compensation is another issue for veterans, with a large percentage of veterans of Afghanistan reportedly filing disability claims. That seems like that's different from past conflicts and wars. The Warriors Refuge assists with disability claims. Can you get into that topic for us? What's different, if anything, with veterans of recent conflicts, and how difficult is it to receive disability compensation?
Well, I will tell you that as far as the uptick, let's answer the first question first. As far as the uptick goes, I believe that the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were very, very different, and I think they might, in some ways, mirror some of what people experienced in Vietnam. Just a different, different scenario, obviously. But so I think that the level of intensity, I think the prolonged in country, in danger, forward operating bases that are on an island to themselves, pretty scary places. I really believe that the change in environment. But let me answer another question about that you're inferring there as well. I also believe that there is a change in the way that the disability ratings are talked about. And I think that probably has impact, an uptick as well, because, I would say, like, let's take my dad, for example. He's a Vietnam War vet. He went for, I would say, 40 years after he got out. And it was at that point that, upon a trip to the VA hospital, somebody then made him aware, by the way, this is tied to your service record, something that happened. And oh yeah, you were there when they had just begun to spray Agent Orange. So this is tied to this. So you might want to think about applying for this. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. I think there's that. I think there's better information today. I also think that there's, as part of the transition program out of the military, they're talking about it as well. But to your third question of how hard is it? I can tell you it's gotten far easier, because I'm classified as a disabled vet myself. I have back injuries. I have some other issues as well. And when I first started, it was all paperwork. It was all these forms and stacks of stuff you had to send in, and you had to have, you name it, you had to have it. But the last update that I did, it was all on the computer, and all I had to do was reference where the VA records were being held, and it was all, I would say, relatively simple. The challenge is when we're working with vets is getting them to talk about it, because sometimes they still don't want to. But I can tell you it's gotten far easier. There's been some complaints with the VA, but I will tell you, one of the things that they have gotten a lot better about, Now, I realize this may also vary by region too, because each region does their own claims processing. But in our region in particular, it has improved dramatically. Turnaround times are, it used to take 2 or 3 years to get a claim reviewed, to maybe then get an appointment to be seen. Now it's maybe a couple of months. It's improved dramatically. I really salute the VA for the work they're doing there, because they've really helped out a lot.
That's good to hear, because sometimes, to your point with that work, they don't get the credit they deserve. And so I appreciate you making that note. So let's talk about Dr. Cliff for a minute, if that's okay.
It's okay.
You've recently started what you call a little project by the name of Your Life Matters. What was the
Yes, sir.
spark of inspiration for Your Life Matters? How does the project work? And what are your goals?
Well, what really sparked it is, now, first of all, let me put this out there. It has absolutely nothing to do with any of the other movements. It really doesn't. It just happens to be something that I feel is important. In my counseling, a lot of times in dealing with veterans and dealing sometimes with individuals, because I'll also work with couples. I'll do some marriage and family therapy as well. A lot of times I find people who are battling depression and who may also be suicidal. There's a sense of hopelessness. There's a sense of, why continue to live? I mean, I don't even understand what my purpose is. And a lot of the current narrative out there is, get some help, just don't do it. There's not, I really hadn't seen a lot of really what I would consider almost, useful narrative. I mean, the standard operating procedures when somebody has an attempt or is claiming to commit, they're getting ready to commit suicide is, you call 911. Not the wrong answer. Okay, I'm not ever going to say that's the wrong answer. When we don't have somebody right there on site, that is our answer. I mean, that is our answer. And if they're and if it's a real opportunity, where they really have the means, we are still making that call. Even as a professional, I had to make that call last week myself. So, but there's this hopelessness, and in our fast-paced society, with all of our interconnections of social media and everything else, we are still one of the most disconnected worlds we've ever been. So without connection, without that, so it got me thinking about the idea of, how can you begin to restore hope? Well, when you think about it, they'll say, what does my life matter anyway? And that got me thinking, well, of course your life matters. And this ties into a theory of positive psychology, where just a little background on the concept of positive psychology. Psychology, counseling, psychiatry was originally started to help people who were truly miserable become less miserable. Okay. And then we have the next step, which is called positive psychology, which was to help people who were less miserable become happy. And one of the key ways, I won't go into all of it, but one of the key ways that they found that helps people take that next step into real happiness is doing something for somebody else, making a difference in somebody else's life that can't repay you. Okay. So I was working with a counseling client, and he was really battling depression. So I thought, let me test some of my ideas out on him. So I did. I said, okay, tell me, what's your profession? Well, he was an insurance adjuster. Okay, you're an insurance adjuster. How many people do you deal with on a daily basis? Well, I deal with, on a weekly basis, I'll deal with 30 people. On a monthly, couple of hundred. Okay. So, and anyway, we went through a couple of scenarios, and by the time we were done, over the course of a 5-year period, if you added all the different people he impacted, you could fill Madison Square Garden with the number of people he was helping. And this same man was telling me, there's no point in living. I am depressed. My life doesn't matter. And by the time we were done, he was bouncing off the walls. He was like, wow, my life does matter. And he went from being borderline suicidal to then turning around and doing that, sharing that same message with other people that he'd run into. Because he would share that, hey, listen, I battled with depression, and hey, listen, and somebody would say, well, I am too. How did you get past it? And he would share that. So it got me thinking, how do we share that message? How do we go from there? And started beginning to put some stories together. And how our life matters. Sometimes it's the little thing that that really matters. Sometimes it's the big thing. Do I have time to share another quick story?
Absolutely.
Okay. And this is something that really, when I first read it, I didn't really know where it was going, but there was this young lady. It was a child. Okay, not a young lady, a child. And they called her Crazy Annie. Okay, Crazy Annie, and she was uncontrollable. And in fact, she had to go into into basically the dungeon of a psych ward because nobody could control her. She would sit for days and look at the wall and not sleep. And then the next day she'd be crawling at the walls and throwing stuff and all that. She was absolutely uncontrollable. And nobody knew what to do with her. They figured she would stay there the rest of her life. Then this elderly nurse came down who had been, coming in and out. And she decided that she was going to spend her lunch hour with Crazy Annie. Okay. And so she began to just talk to her. She would sing to her. Sometimes Annie would be staring at the walls. Sometimes she'd be bouncing off the walls. Didn't matter. But she would just sing to her. And then one day, as she was finishing up her lunch, she left just a small portion of her brownie on her intake area of her cell. And the next day, she came back and that little brownie was gone. And no changes at first, but then we fast forward, this goes on for several months. They begin to actually have conversations. And within a year, Crazy Annie is up in the regular ward, getting real cognitive help. And within 5 years, she's told, you're cured, with somebody who had no cure, and you can go home now. And she made the decision, because now she was an adult. She made the decision, no, I want to stay because I want to help the next one. Well, I know that nobody knows the name Crazy Annie necessarily, but a lot of people do know the name Ann Sullivan, who was the one that taught Helen Keller, who was in that same ward at first. And her life made a difference. Her life mattered, from somebody who had a hopeless diagnosis. But what's interesting is, think about it for just a minute, Chris, and this is what gets me excited. It started with this elderly nurse who just wanted to see if she could spend a little time and sing to this young girl who was diagnosed as hopeless, and then shared a little bit of brownie with her. All of that, how many lives did that end up impacting? So our lives matter. And stories like that are just exciting to me. And we just never know the impact we were going to have. It's like the movie It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey, he wanted to kill himself, then he realized how big a difference his small portion of his world made. And I think that if we can build those internal narratives about how, wow, we really are important. It's not an ego thing. It's just this, I've made a difference in my small way or my large way. So that's kind of where that's gone.
Well, I love that you shared that story, and it's amazing when you start thinking about the exponential growth. I know you said you really want to talk about statistics, you'd rather tell stories, but you gave statistics by talking about filling Madison Square Garden. That's, when you put it in perspective like that, it really makes somebody, at least me, pause for a second and think about, okay, what can I do to help Crazy Annie or whoever it may be? So I'm glad you shared that story. And staying along the lines of talking about Dr. Cliff, you're in the process of writing a book. What's the theme and how's that all going for you?
Well, I've actually been working pretty hard at it. It's actually called Your Life Matters, and it's not just it's talking about stories like I just shared. Plus, it's going to also include, like, your marriage matters, your service to this country matters. In other words, whether it's military or first responders, because you get to first responders, there's another high rate of suicide. And what I really want to do is I want to help people change their internal narrative and really begin to look at life from from a different perspective. One of the things that also kind of inspires me is I'm a man of faith. Okay. And there's this passage in the Bible that where Jesus tells his disciples, you're the salt of the earth. Sometimes people think that they don't really know what that means. You're the salt of the earth. But if you do a little research, you find that during that era, salt was the most valuable commodity in the world. It was literally traded equally for gold. So what he's telling these people who are fishermen, who are, tax collectors, they are not the best, they're not the highest society people. They're telling them that basically you're the most valuable people on the planet. You are worth equal to gold, and that's the message. Is the things you do matter. Things you do impact somebody else, and I think it's amazing if we would kind of take that mantra that we matter. Maybe if we could do one thing for somebody else on a weekly basis, what that would matter. Share a personal story that also kind of tied this together. I too have battled with depression. Okay, I have battled. I've battled with depression at times. Kind of dealt with some of the same issue. I was talking with it was a good friend at the time. She later became my wife, but we were really good friends, and I was really battling with depression. She told me, I know we're running close on time, but she told me, listen, I just want you to get out of the house. I want you to go to Walmart. Okay. I want you to go to Walmart, and I want you to buy a flower pot. It was fall. I want you to buy a flower pot, walk out the store, and give it to somebody. Okay. Just give it to somebody. And I thought she was crazy. Okay. I absolutely thought she was nuts. She finally talked me into it, and I did it. And I went in there. They bought this nice little flower pot, and I walked out the store, and I began to look at people, and I began to see. And there was this little old lady. She was pushing her cart. She was looking down, and I walked up to her and said, "Hey, I want to give this to you. I just feel like it'll brighten your day." And it's like it changed everything. And I ended up helping her with her groceries and all that, and it lifted me out. It lifted her up, and it felt so good. I went and did it again. Went and got another one, and I did the same thing again for somebody else. And while it may have impacted them, the impact it had on me was transformative. It really helped me get out of that depressive mode, and it really all ties back into that positive psychology and
exponential growth, like we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pay it forward.
Yes, sir.
So folks want to get in touch with you, they can reach you at thewarriorsrefuge.us.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Cliff Robertson Jr., thanks so much for being with us today.
It was an honor, Chris. It truly is. And I love this show. I love what you're doing here.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in to Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. For more details about upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure. And if you like what you hear, be sure to tell your friends to tune in too. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.